Dr. Kent Brantley knows a thing or two about plagues. A few years before the current COVID-19 pandemic, Kent was a medical missionary serving the West African country of Liberia during the devastating Ebola epidemic of the mid-2010s. And in 2014, while treating patients in his clinic, he contracted the Ebola virus himself. And he and his co-worker, Nancy Wrightball, were near death when they were flown to the United States for treatment, becoming the first people with the Ebola virus on American soil. Now, the thing about Ebola is that it kills very quickly and very painfully. But here in the United States, Kent and Nancy were subjected to an experimental cure that was able to save his life. And after a month of quarantining in his hospital room in Atlanta, he was finally able to reunite with his wife and family. Now, I followed this story closely, especially since Kent and I have many mutual friends. As though I've never met him personally, he is a graduate of Abilene Christian University, which my wife and I attended a few years after he did, and he's gone to church with several of my friends. He is a member of the Southside Church of Christ in Fort Worth, Texas. And so my social media feeds were filled with prayer requests and news updates about Kent's situation, as well as praise and thanksgiving when he at last recovered. And with the national spotlight on him, Kent released a few statements since gaining all the media attention. And one thing that stood out was how open he was about his Christian faith. For it was his faith that called him to West Africa to treat those whom no one else would have treated. And it was his faith in God that carried him through his suffering, for he believed that God was able to save him and that God would save him. But the scope of his faith was even more than that. One of my Bible professors at ACU, Randy Harris, shared a story about how he got a call from Kent one day from his quarantined room at Emory Hospital. See, Randy had been one of Kent's mentors for years, ever since teaching his ethics class in college. And as it turned out, Randy was scheduled to be a guest preacher at Kent's church that coming Sunday. And so he asked him if there's anything he wanted to share with his church family that morning. And Randy said that he'll never forget what Kent said next. Because Kent told Randy that since he'd learned about having this deadly disease, he'd been thinking a lot about 3 Jewish young men standing before the king of Babylon and his demands to bow down or face the fiery furnace. And he'd been thinking about how they actually could have opted for safety and security, but instead of taking that, they told the king, "We know our God is able to save us from the fiery furnace. But even if he does not, we will not bow." And that phrase, "but even if he does not," stood out to Kent, because he believed that God was able to save him from Ebola, and he had faith that he would. But even if that wasn't going to happen, and he was to die from that terrible disease, Kent would remain faithful. Kent's faith is the same faith of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, which is the faith of even if. And in a moment, we're going to read that story in Daniel chapter 3. But first, if you're curious as to where Kent Brantley is today, perhaps this doesn't surprise you, but last year, he and his family returned to Africa, and they are now in Zambia, helping with the COVID pandemic there. Once again, bringing healing and care to people who really need it. And in a recent interview, he was asked, after nearly losing your life to Ebola in 2014, why did you decide to return to Africa in 2020? And this is his response. As a doctor and as a nurse, my wife, Amber, and I feel called to use our professional skills in service to people in need. We believe that God has placed a calling on our lives, and we've expressed that call as a threefold vision: to care for the poor, to have compassion on people in need, and to participate in the coming of God's kingdom on this earth, to participate in his work of restoration, fixing the broken things in this world. And we've been eager to return to this type of work and life ever since I recovered from Ebola, and we are thankful for the opportunity to be back in Africa again. God bless the Brantleys. Let's talk about a golden statue. Daniel 3 begins with the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar II making an image of gold that's around 90 feet high. And actually, to be technical, it may not have actually been a statue. It could have been a stele, which is like a pillar or an obelisk. We just read that as a golden image. Steles were monuments to a king, but often involved offerings to the gods. And at the king's command, a whole orchestra of instruments would play, and upon hearing it, everyone was to bow in worship before the image of gold. And if they didn't, they were to be cast into a blazing furnace. But not everyone did. Soon it came to the king's attention that 3 of the Jews who had been taken into Babylon and who had joined the king's royal court were refusing to bow. And their names were Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Younger generations might remember the VeggieTales episode about Rack, Shack, and Benny going up against the mean Mr. Nebuchadnezzar. This is a story that we often teach to our children, and they are good lessons for them to learn, but let us not forget that these are messages and lessons for adults as well. And what we see in Daniel chapter 3 is the continuation of the experience of exiles living in a foreign land. This series that we're on in Daniel is what I'm calling Living Well in Exile. See, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were young Jewish men taken into captivity in Babylon, along with Daniel and countless other members of the Jewish elite. See, these men were young, handsome, intelligent, strong. And King Nebuchadnezzar wanted to make them Babylonian in all things, including in their names. See, their Hebrew names were Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. But they were given these new names, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And oddly, the author of Daniel uses their Babylonian names, but not for Daniel, who was given the name Belteshazzar. But while many of their peers gave in and became assimilated into Babylonian culture, the 4 of them were firmly rooted in their Jewish identity, and they demonstrated integrity by remaining faithful to God. Now, earlier in chapter 1, they had done so in times of prosperity. But here, we are seeing them do so even in times of danger. And that is what integrity is about, after all. Even with their lives at stake, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego refused to bow down to that 8-story tall golden image. And here's what happens next. Picking up in verse 13, we read this. Furious with rage, Nebuchadnezzar summoned Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and so these men were brought before the king. And Nebuchadnezzar said to them, "Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the image of gold that I have set up? Now, when you hear the sound of the horn, the flute, the zither, the lyre, harp, pipe, and all kinds of music, if you are ready to fall down and worship the image I made, very good. But if you do not worship it, you will be thrown immediately into a blazing furnace. And then what God will be able to rescue you from my hand?" Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to him, "King Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to deliver us from it, and he will deliver us from your majesty's hand. But even if he does not, we want you to know, your majesty, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold that you have set up. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were not going to bow down before anything or anyone, for their allegiance and obedience was to the true God and to God alone. They were not going to give in regardless of what was going to happen to them, even when that led them to a furnace that was hotter than hot. For they believed in a God that could save them, though they still didn't know what would happen. Now, obviously, they didn't want to burn and die, and they prayed that God would save them, but they didn't know that God would do that for certain. Maybe he would, maybe he wouldn't. All they knew was that regardless of the outcome, they would trust in God and obey only him. And some might ask, what kind of faith is that? Now, shouldn't they have had absolute certainty, without a doubt, that God was going to save them? Or on the contrary, why have any faith at all if you aren't absolutely certain? And in response, I ask this question. When we say that we have faith in God, are we saying that we have faith that God will do what God will do? Or are we saying that we have faith that God will do what we want God to do? Because those are two very different ideas. And I think many Christians have gotten the idea of faith wrong with dangerous results. There are stories out there, people who have fallen ill, but they had faith that God would heal them, and they were so convinced that God would cure them of their disease or affliction that they would forego medicine, or they wouldn't see a doctor. Taking medicine, in their view, was a sign of having a weak faith or lacking it altogether. And the great tragedy in these stories is that so many of them led to critical danger or even death. And those who survive are left feeling very confused and dejected, saying, I had faith that God would heal me, but God didn't. What happened? And what happened more often than not was a misunderstanding of what biblical faith is. Because the faith that is seen in the men and women of the Bible is the faith of even if God does not. It is persistent and tenacious and continues on even when everything is going wrong. But it is not a faith that is based on delusion, nor is it about living in denial and hopelessness, naive optimism. The faith of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego was not a blind faith that, in spite of everything, God will miraculously make everything better at the last possible second. They did believe that God could do that and that God was able, but their faith was not hinged on certain expectations. Compare that to others today who see faith as having faith in a certain outcome, that I am 100% sure that God is going to answer my prayer and that God will do so in this particular way. On the contrary, biblical faith does not rest on what God will or will not do, but it is based on who God is. Faith is trust. It is trusting that God is going to do what God is going to do, whatever that is, regardless of what we want or expect, or if it goes completely opposite to that. It is okay because God always does what is best. It is trusting in God even when everything is going wrong. Because we believe that God loves us and has our best interest in mind, we trust that God will do what God will do. And this is the faith that allows us, even as we face a fiery furnace, or whatever may come our way, to be able to say, but even if. And so we could stop right there, and the lesson would remain the same. But let's finish the story and see what ends up with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And you may remember how the story ends. After refusing to bow, mean Mr. Nezer was not a happy man. And in verse 19, we read that then Nebuchadnezzar was furious with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and his attitude toward them changed. He ordered the furnace heated 7 times hotter than usual and commanded some of the strongest soldiers in his army to tie up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and throw them into the blazing furnace. And so these men, wearing their robes, trousers, turbans, and other clothes, were bound and thrown into the fiery blazing furnace. And the king's command was so urgent and the furnace so hot, the flames of the fire killed the soldiers who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these 3 men, firmly tied, fell into the blazing furnace. And then King Nebuchadnezzar leaped to his feet in amazement and asked his advisors, "Weren't there 3 men that we tied up and threw into the fire?" They replied, "Certainly, Your Majesty." And he said, "Look, I see 4 men walking around in the fire, unbound and unharmed. And the 4th looks like a son of the gods." Nebuchadnezzar then approached the opening of the blazing furnace and shouted, "Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out, come here." So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out of the fire. And the satraps, prefects, governors, and royal advisors crowded around them. And they saw that the fire had not harmed their bodies, nor was a hair of their heads singed. Their robes were not scorched, and there was no smell of fire on them. And then Nebuchadnezzar said, "Praise be to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and rescued his servants. They trusted in him and defied the king's command and were willing to give up their lives rather than serve or worship any god except their own God. Therefore, I decree that the people of any nation or language who say anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be cut into pieces and their houses be turned into piles of rubble, for no other God can save in this way." And then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. The faith of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego is the faith of even if. For faith is not trust in what we want to happen. Faith is trust in God. And for all they knew, they were going to die in that furnace. Their lives were to be taken from them, and yet they still would not bow. They remained faithful even unto certain death. And that God did eventually save them was nearly irrelevant to their faithfulness. They simply trusted in God to do what God was going to do, no matter what. And in doing so, they joined the ranks of countless people of faith in the Bible, many who are listed among that famous hall of faith in Hebrews chapter 11. Men and women like Noah and Abraham and Sarah and others who did great things by their faith in God. And they trusted in him, despite not knowing what was going to happen to them. But the author of Hebrews, in detailing these things, doesn't shy from the ugly details of their lives, and that their lives were hard. They suffered. And not all of them were saved. They all died, and some of them died gruesome deaths. He writes that some were imprisoned, some were tortured, and some were executed violently. And they all died in faith, still not having received what was promised to them, but they held on in hope that even after their deaths, God was going to do what God was going to do. Things didn't always work out the way that the people of faith wanted things to happen, but that didn't stop their faithfulness. For they had faith even if. Perhaps then, that the surest test of your faith is when God says no, or when God remains silent. What happens when you don't get what you want or get what you pray for? When there is no healing? When you lose your job? When you lose the house? What would have happened if Kent Brantley had died of Ebola? Perhaps some would have questioned the point of their prayers. But not Kent, though. And not Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Beyond the pages of the Bible, there are many stories throughout Christian history of martyrs who went to their deaths because of their unrelenting, unconditional, even if faith, including many of the apostles. There was a Christian by the name of John Chrysostom that lived in the 4th and 5th century. And he wasn't a martyr, but he came very, very close. One day he was brought before the Roman Empress Eudoxia and commanded to renounce Christ. And the empress threatened him, saying that if he would not renounce Christ, that he would be banished from the country forever. He would be separated from his father's land for the rest of his life. And John responded, "You cannot. For the whole world is my Father's land. You cannot banish me from it." Well, then the empress said, "I will take away all of your property and treasures." And John replied, "You cannot, for all of my true treasures are in heaven." Well, then the empress said, "I will send you to a place of absolute solitude where there is not one friend for you to talk to." And John said, "You cannot. For I have a friend that is closer than a brother to me. He is my elder brother, Jesus Christ, who was promised to be with me always to the very end of the age." And in anger, the empress finally said, "I will then take your life." And John said, "You cannot. For my life is forever hidden in Christ with God." And may we say the same. For this is the gospel that we are preaching, and the good news we are proclaiming, not just with our words, but with our lives. Even if. Let us be of the same spirit of John Chrysostom, Kent Brantley, and those 3 Jewish young men in Babylon. Now, while we are fortunate to live in a place where we are not likely to die for our faith, not likely to face a fiery furnace, we still have faith struggles of lesser magnitudes. We all have to trust in God each and every day. But regardless of what happens to us, let us have faith in God. And let us trust God to do what God does. And let our faith be strong and resilient, even if. And may the world see that. And may God receive all glory and honor and praise. Amen.